My name is Manni Singh. I'm the cropping systems agronomist at Michigan State. And that's a big word, right? What does that mean? Can anybody tell me? Simply means I get to work across multiple crops, right? So unlike Dennis or Laura, she tells me that corn is a weed in her book. So
it's a rotational crop for soybean.
okay, so we'll live with that. So I get to work across multiple crops. Right now my focus has been corn, soybean, and winter wheat. So I've been doing multiple projects on those crops. So today I'm focusing especially on the soybean project that we did over the last 2 years. A lot of interesting information in that. So again, this is Michigan-specific data. I think a lot of this correlates to you guys down here. We are not too far out of Michigan here, right? So we still feels like I'm not too far. So the focus in this project is thinking about our management and asking a question, do we need to change our management based on when we are able to plant, right? Because we are setting our yield potential at the time of planting, right? So we plant, we are setting the yield potential, and then we are trying to protect that yield potential as we go through the growing season, managing weeds, managing insect diseases, right? And this has become a challenge, right? So this is some Michigan data, what happened in 2019. Dennis showed a couple of pictures. This is just putting that in some data figures here. By early June, we were not even 30% planted. I assume it was about the same for you guys down here, right? Way below our 5-year average. So that was 2019, right? But we have seen that story where in the recent years we are seeing more of this variable weather that's causing our planting window to become more variable, right? And that's a concern for us. And here is some long-term data that our climatologists gave me. This is coming from Great Lakes area. So this data shows that over the last 50 to 100 years, our total amount of rainfall has gone up by about 11%. And more of this rainfall is coming up in these heavy rainfall events. So we are getting more rainfall in less number of heavy events. And more of this is coming down during that springtime, when we are trying to out there be able to plant, right? So that's causing these poor field conditions and resulting in this variable planting window that we have to manage. And that is a negative for us, right? Along with that negative, we do have a positive here. If we look at the same data, our frost-free season has gone up by about 9 days in that same window. And we are so far north in the production belt, right? Length of growing season is one of the biggest limitation. Before moving to Michigan, I was in Florida for about 10 years or so. Did I care about the length of growing season there? No, right? It was the whole dang 365 days. And a researcher, I wasn't happy about it because I had to be out in the field every single day. But again, this was not, this is our concern, right? So we are getting a benefit. So this is a positive for us. The question is how can we benefit from that, right? How we can utilize this little bit of an extra longer season that we are getting on both ends of our spectrum. So again, coming back to asking that question that do we benefit from changing our agronomic management based on when we are able to plant? How we can minimize these negatives and how we can benefit from this positive that we have, right? So it comes back to this slide, and I will come back to this slide throughout my talk. Let's look at multiple planting times here, right? Starting with the early season, that we are able to plant early in the growing season. The negative here is these cool and wet soil conditions that we have to deal with, right? And this increase in rainfall amount is causing a concern there. But the benefit is that now we have a longer growing season that we can benefit from. So how we can tweak our management to fit those planting conditions. Coming to that mid-season, now we are okay. Our planting conditions are okay in terms of the soil, ideal soil temperature, the right soil moisture we need to be planting into, right? And then we move into the late season. Hopefully we don't need to be planting late, but then 2019 happens, right? So we need to have tools in our kit to understand and be ready for those challenges. Here, our biggest concern is length of the growing season, how we can manage our crop with that limited season that is ahead of us, along with this lack of moisture. So again, because of these unique planting conditions at each of these planting times, do we need to be tweaking our management, right? And there is, when we talk about planting time, we often talk about, is there a yield penalty? And because, again, we are so far in the north, we are limited in the length of growing season. We do see a yield penalty. Here is some data that Laura did here back in 2013 and 2014. You can see at least 2 of the 3 locations she studied, there's about a half bushel decline in yield per day after, I believe she went with the May 1st date, right? So this is Ohio. We are doing some similar work in Michigan, and we are seeing somewhat similar results. Some data from 2018 and 2019, if you look at this, with the delay in planting, we are losing that about anywhere from 0.3 to 0.6 bushels per acre per day, right? So we know, again, for our production environment, we do see a yield penalty if we get delayed. But the question we are asking in this research is how we can minimize that yield penalty, right? As we move down in this planting window, how we can improve our yield potential. So moving this curve a little bit more close to flat. It's not going to look like flat. It's going to have a depth, but how we can minimize that, right? So how we can improve our yield potential, or put it another way, how we can minimize the input cost down here. Because at the end of the day, the goal is how we can make more money, right? So either by improving the yield potential or by minimizing that input cost, we'll get to this increased yield potential, increased profit. And that is the final goal that we are trying to target in this research. So we designed this research asking specific questions about what we can do based on our planting time, right? And here is a Michigan figure, so bear with me. I will try to correlate this to Ohio. We asked 3 specific questions in terms of planting management. The first one was the variety selection. What maturity group do we need to be using to maximize or utilize our growing season to the full extent? So because soybean is a day-length sensitive crop, we have these multiple maturity groups, right? So Michigan, we divide into these 3 different zones. We have a maturity group of 1.5, 2, and 2.5. This is university recommendation based on our soybean performance trial, similar to what Laura does in Ohio. But the challenge with that data is that's based on 1 planting time, and that is the optimal window planting time, right? So we do not know what is the optimum if we are able to plant earlier or if the planting gets delayed. So the question we are asking is, if we are able to plant early, can we use a longer maturity group compared to whatever our standard is and be able to benefit by utilizing the whole length of that growing season, right? On the other side, if the planting is delayed, do we need to be changing our maturity group again? And here we are asking that, do we benefit by going to a short maturity group because we have a short growing season ahead of us, right? And I'll come back to the Ohio comparison here. So that's the first question. The second question we are asking is, do we need to be changing our seeding rates based on when we are able to plant? To maintain that high yield potential, maybe save something on the input cost so we have more money at the end. Along those similar lines, the third question is, how about the seed treatment? Do we benefit from a seed treatment based on the unique environment we are planting into? And planting at different times give us a unique environment, so to speak, right? So these are the 3 questions I will come back to in my presentation. Going back to that first question, I did look at the Ohio reference, and here is what I was able to find. These 3 maturity groups, so mainly around, I think we are about around here, so is around 3 maturity group. Is that sound typical to what you guys grow around here? Anything longer, shorter? About our average? So again, 3 and 3.5 down here, right? So the same question, if we're planting early, can we push this to a little bit longer maturity group? On the other side, if we are delayed, can we go towards a shorter maturity group? So again, keep these numbers in mind as I go through some of my data, because that is Michigan-specific maturity groups that we are using, right? But the relative comparison still should be pretty valid. So to answer these questions, we designed this research We went to 2 different locations, MSU campus right here, and our bean and beet farm up in the thumb area. They represent these 2 maturity group zones that we have in Michigan, where most of our production is based on the color in this figure that you can see. So 2 locations, and we repeated this in 2018 and 2019. 2019, based on how the season went, you might be thinking, how did we get multiple plantings in? But for some reason, it worked for us. We planted these 4 different times, going with as early as we can. And here I'm not talking about these ultra early planting dates. I have heard a lot of reports about growers in Michigan planting mid-March or 1st of April. Does anybody do that around here? Couple? How early have you guys gone?
1st of April.
1st of April. Anybody tried anything before that? Maybe. So we didn't shoot for too early. Our goal was to stick with those optimal temperature and moisture conditions. About 50 degrees and with a favorable forecast and optimal soil moisture. And then we just split it up, went with the very late season being end of June, just to see, have that diversity in our planting times. In terms of maturity groups, we used 6 different maturity groups. Again, to get to the both extremes, we went as low as a maturity group 1.0, and we went with as high as a 3.5 group bean. We picked the genetics from the same seed company to make sure that what we are testing is a difference because of maturity groups and not due to difference in genetic potentials. We picked 5 seeding rates, again, on the low and the high end, as high as 210,000 seeds per acre, as low as 50,000 seeds per acre, to see again where that optima lies. And these are the 2 main factors that I will be talking about today. We also had the seed treatment comparison, where we did use naked beans and compare them to a complete seed treatment. Multiple fungicides, insecticide, and it had a biological nematicide component in it. Did not have any inoculant in that. So please keep that in mind. And all of this work was done in 15-inch row spacing. That is the dominant row spacing we have in Michigan. And we used conventional tillage for all of this. So keep that in mind as we look at the data. A lot of plots that we did. You can see over here going down, I got my multiple maturity groups. You can see a nice color difference here because they're at different phenological stage. Going across, I got my multiple planting dates. I think across all of our studies, we had about 300 plots per year. So 4 site years, we had about 1,200 plots where we collected all of this data. And I had a grad student who was able to do all of this work. Otherwise, we would not have been able to do all of this. So starting with the results, I'll again start with this slide, and we'll go with each of these planting times. Starting with that early season planting, what we are finding out there in terms of those 3 questions that I was asking up front. Number 1 being the maturity group. What are we finding out there, right? I'll have a couple of slides that will look like this. I got my 6 maturity groups here, going from a group 1 bean on the left all the way to a 3.5 bean on the right. And I got my yield on the y-axis here. Again, looking at the early planting, where we were able to achieve that between April 25th and 30th. Here's all of that data. 2 years, 2018, 2019, 2 sites. MSU campus and then down at the bean and beet farm in the thumb area. If you look at all of this, what I want to follow you is look at these trends. As we went with a longer maturity group, we did see a yield bump under these early planting conditions. If you remember that initial map I showed you, our optima is around there, 2 to 2.5. So when we pushed that to at least a 0.5 or longer group bean, we were able to gain anywhere between 6 to 11 bushels on an acre. And we did see that trend across all of our 4 site years. That when we are able to plant early in the growing season, we are going to a higher yield by pushing on that maturity. Compared to that optimum, if we go to that little bit longer, we do benefit. You might be asking that might be a recipe for disaster. That are those beans going to mature in time or not, right? That's an important factor. So we collected a lot of data on the development of those beans as they were progressing in the growing season. So looking at the phenology, and this is data from 2018. A lot happening here, but if you follow me along, I think it'll all make sense. I got my 4 planting dates here, starting with April, going to end of June. I have only 3 maturity groups here as a comparison, a 1, a 2, and a 3 group bean. The first thing I want you to be looking here is the time to achieve the R7 growth stage. R7 is when there is 1 mature pod on a single soybean plant in about 50% of the whole field. So that is a stage when about 95% of yield potential is already determined, right? So if a frost were to occur, yield penalty is going to be minimal, right? If we look at all these dates, our first killing frost in 2018 was around October 17th, and that is our median date in Lansing area. All of these beans were able to mature except when we were planting really late in the season and using a longer maturity group. But here we are talking about early planting, right? In here, and using a longer group bean. That's where we are seeing a yield bump. If you look at this date, that's September 22nd. So about 20 days before that first killing frost. So that means I'm able to get the high yield. I'm able to mature a good time before that first frost occurs. That gives me time to dry down and be in good harvesting condition, right? So this is 2018. When I looked at data from 2019, we saw a similar response, that those early plantings using a longer group bean, we were able to mature sometime in September. We had a delayed frost in 2019, about 10 days delay compared to our normal median date. So we were lucky that with all those delayed plantings, even down here, when we planted and even these beans were able to mature, but they didn't have enough time to dry down to that optimal moisture condition, right? So again, coming back to early planting, we again seeing a yield benefit by pushing to a long group bean, be able to mature in time. Just to make sure we understood why that's happening, and it's not a difference in genetics, but we are seeing a real maturity group impact. We looked at how much time those beans are spending in each phenological stages, right? Because the idea is, again, now we have a longer growing season, planting early. Can we utilize that season in a better way? So all of these colors that you're seeing in here, that points to that data. The blue color is the time the seed spent before it emerged. The orange color is the time spent between emergence and flowering. The gray color is the time spent flowering and putting the pods on. And then the yellow color is the time the plant spent filling that seed, right? So we were thinking if we are seeing a yield benefit, it must be coming from over here. You can see we had about a 10-day increase, 45 days compared to 35, time spent filling those seeds by using a longer maturity group. So our thinking was maybe we are seeing a higher seed weight with those early planted longer maturity group beans. When we looked at that data, yield against our seed weight, we did not see a correlation there. That we are pushing to a higher yield, but it's not coming from a higher seed weight. So if it's not coming from a higher seed weight, what else do you guys think it's coming from? Number of seeds, right? So those are the yield components, similar to what Dennis was talking about, right? Seed weight is the first component. Number 2 is our number of seeds per unit area. You can divide that into even number of pods per unit area, and then that correlates to number of seeds. And here we saw this nice correlation. So we are able to put more number of pods, actually more number of nodes. That equates to more number of pods per unit area, and that's giving us more number of seeds per unit area. And then we are not losing seed weight here. So by gaining more number of seeds and maintaining that seed weight, we are able to push to a higher yield potential, right? So coming back to this phenology data, we did see that extra time spent in seed filling, right? But if you back it up, the time spent in flowering and pod development, we had an extra 10 to 15 days in there. So that did make sense, right? That we are getting that yield bump by that plant spending more time putting more number of nodes and more number of pods on that plant. And then we are able to maintain the weight of those more number of seeds by spending this extra time in that seed filling duration. All right, so that was the first component, maturity group. The second component we looked at was seeding rate. Do we need to be changing seeding rate again based on the planting time and what we are seeing with that early planting? I assume everybody can tell me which way this goes. High seeding rate on the right or on the left? Right. And you all have seen probably this in your fields, right? And that does correlate pretty well. So down here, we are at 50,000. If you come to the right, we are at that highest seeding rate. And you can see number of branches. We only have about a single branch over here. And on that left, with that low plant stand, we are almost up to 4 branches. And it's not only more number of branches, you can see number of pods on those branches as well. So this talk tells you the unique ability of this soybean plant to compensate for that low stand by looking around, by looking at the space that plant has and be able to produce more branches. And all of the other varieties that we used in this trial, they are these semi or medium bushy bean varieties that will branch out based on the space that the plant is able to see, right? So I will show you some data on what we find out on our seeding rates. But just looking at this, if we are down here, will you expect a huge yield penalty? Probably not, right? Because you can see you probably need at least 2, if not more, of these plants to compensate for this nice bushy plant, right? So that again is a positive. But along with the positive, there's almost always a negative. So we did see one. This is my low pod height. So at these high seeding rates, our lowest pod was about 4.5 inches off the ground. As we move towards these low plant stands, look what happened. We are all only about 3 inches off the ground. So height of the cutter bar is going to be an important aspect here, right? Because even though we might not be losing a whole lot of yield here, there might be more harvesting losses. So height of the cutter bar or having a uniform field is going to be important. Maybe field rolling might play a role for us to make sure that we are going low enough, right? Here is that same picture in a data slide. I got my plant populations here on the x-axis. So we are accounting for any germination loss, which is about 90% or so for most of the varieties, right? And you can see that right on the tag, your germ number. And then any emergence loss, right? And for us, it was anywhere from 80 to 90%. And that's where the specific field conditions might vary as well. But I have that final plant stand on x-axis and then my economic returns on y-axis. So we're calculating that based on about a $9.4 beans, accounting for any seed cost, and we are also accounting for any price discount if we are at a high moisture or a low test weight. So we are accounting for all of that. And I have my 2 locations in 2 different colors, 2018 on the left and 2019 on the right. If you look at these regression lines in both of these graphs, they look pretty flat, right? What does that mean? Simply means as we are putting more seeds or as we have more plants in the ground, our yield is not going up. That we are not seeing a relation between our plant stand and profits. And I did do ANOVA on this. We did see a yield penalty at 50,000. But I was surprised that even at 90,000, we did not see a yield penalty. So that again goes back to what I showed in the picture before, right? That the soybean plants are able to compensate for that low plant stand. What this data means is we don't want to start planting that low, but wherever we are, there might be a potential to go with an incremental low number, right? Put another strip out in the field at 10, 15, 20% lower compared to where you have been planting and see what happens, right? All right. So Another question I get asked is, as we move to a low plant stand, how about weed control? Are there going to be more issues with that, right? I'm not a weed scientist, but I've been working with our specialists, and we did collect some data. We are still working through that, but you can see that in this picture, on the left, I have my higher plant stand. This is, I believe, at 170,000 seeds per acre. This is 130. Over here, we are still okay. I did not see high weed pressure here. This stand is at 90,000. Here, now you can start seeing these gaps, right? And that's where we were starting to see some weed pressure come up. So what we were noticing was, as we moved down to lower plant stand, uniformity of that stand was really important. So what Dennis was talking about, ability to singulate, right? Making sure our seed spacing is optimum so we don't have these big gaps. And that's where we were seeing some of the high weed pressures.
Your gaps, are they more in the early planted than they are in the mid later?
Yep. And I have some data right here. So this is my weed count on the y-axis. And I got my 4 planting times over here. And these 5 different colors within the planting date are my 5 different seeding rates. So what you will notice right off the bat here is we had a much higher weed pressure with the early plantings compared to the mid, late, and very, very late planting. And only within this early planting, you can see as we push down to our low plant stand, we started to see a high weed pressure. And that went back to your comment on we were seeing more gaps because of those non-ideal planting conditions, right? So we did see some of weed control issues with the early planting and where we went down to low plant stand. Compared to if you were in the mid or late, then changing our seeding rate did not really matter. Because we were able to, again, I believe, get a more uniform plant stand even at those low populations because the planting conditions are more conducive, right? So coming back to, that was the second component. Coming back to the third component, seed treatment. And this is something that did surprise us. So we, again, use a complete seed treatment. You would expect the seed treatment to benefit under these early planting conditions, right? Cool and wet soil conditions. When we planted in April, our soil temperature was right around at 50 degree threshold. Compared to late in the season, we were much, much warmer. And if you see in that early planting, in 2019, we spent 25 days before we saw even our plant stand. The grassroots was going out there, and after 15, 20 days, we kind of lost hope that we have a stand lost. But the beans did come up. And we were surprised by the capability of those soybean seeds to be able to germinate. And we had a higher than 75% stand, even under these challenging conditions. So looking at that seed treatment component, we did see an improvement in plant stand in 2 out of our 4 site yields. You can see over here, we had about 83 versus 78% of target population. So about a 5% improvement in plant stand when we use that seed treatment. But when we looked at our economic returns, accounting for the cost of that seed treatment, we did not gain anything. And we were surprised by that because we did expect, at least in 2019, that with those early planting conditions, it took forever for those beans to germinate. We still did not see a benefit. And that might be because of the unique environment we had within our fields, right? Again, we had 4 site yields. We probably didn't have enough of a pathogen insect pressure to see that impact. So that's something I would definitely be careful about. Wrapping that up, early planting season for us. What we are seeing, that we are benefiting by pushing maturity group a little bit longer and be able to get a yield, a consistent yield penalty across all of our site yields. In terms of seeding rate, we did not benefit by pushing to a higher threshold. So we use 130,000 as our standard. So we did not see a benefit of pushing beyond that number, even under those early planting conditions. Seed treatment, again, in our case, it was limited to stand improvement. But these 2 aspects, I would be careful. Seeding rate, pushing down on seeding rate, or getting rid of maybe the seed treatment, not as a whole, but maybe a component of seed treatment, right? Based on the on the pest pressure in a specific field, maybe sticking with just a fungicide. So just picking a component, but at least keeping one of these components as an insurance policy, because we're still under early planting, non-optimal field conditions, right? So still using that to some extent makes sense. If we want to cut down, maybe this is the mid-season is where we might need to be starting. And I will share some data there. So that was early season. Now let's move to that mid-season planting, which in Michigan we define that anywhere from that 10th or 15th of May to end of May. That was our initial thought. But when we did this study, we planted 2 different times. We planted around mid-May, and then we planted around early June, thinking that we might see a differing response based on those 2 planting times, right? We did not. So all the 3 questions we were asking, we did not see any difference between the mid-May and early June planting. And I have some data here. So again, this is my mid-May planting in the top 2 figures. In the bottom 2, I have my early June planting. Just one location. So what we are finding in here is, regardless of the maturity group now we are using, we don't benefit by pushing to a higher, a longer bean, and we do not get penalized by going with a shorter bean. Compared to the early season, if you remember that, we were seeing that staircase increase by pushing to a longer group bean, right? So in this planting window, we are not benefiting by using a longer group bean. Or put it in a different context, if the goal is to have some extra time, at the end of soybean harvest, Dennis was talking about planting wheat after soybean, right? Or maybe a cover crop, or maybe a fall tillage. In this planting window, we can push to some of these shorter maturity beans compared to what we have been using, minimize our soybean yield penalty, and still able to get that extra time at the end of the season. Going to that second question now, seeding rate, right? Pretty similar results compared to what we found with the early planting. Again, here I have my final plant stand on x-axis and my economic returns on y-axis. We did not see any relation between our final stand and our economic returns or yield for that matter. Here we even dropped down to 50,000 and still not see a yield penalty. So we were surprised by that. But again, the idea is that maybe this is the planting window where we can start thinking about maybe cutting down on the seeding rate, right? Go with, again, a sequential decline, 10, 15, 20% based on what you feel comfortable with, and see if that works out at that specific field with the yield limiting factors that might be playing a role in there, right? The third piece of our equation, looking at the seed treatment. Here we actually did not expect much to see, and that's exactly, I think, what our data showed. We only had one location where we did see a benefit in terms of higher plant stand, only about like 4% or so when we used a seed treatment. Otherwise, we did not see an improvement even in plant stand. And it did translate into no economic returns. When we looked at economic returns data, you can see the control versus treated, you can see flat. But we did not see a profit loss as well. So that's another point to keep in mind. In this, again, mid-season planting window, for us, that mid-May to early June planting time here. So coming back to this mid-season window, what are we seeing here? Limited impact of changing that maturity group. So maybe we can push to some of these shorter maturities here if the goal is to save some time after that soybean harvest, right? No benefits from increasing our seeding rate. So there was no benefit going beyond that 130,000 that we typically go with. And there's actually a potential to cut down on the seeding rate here, right? Remember, up here, we didn't see much, but again, we are dealing with those cool and wet soil conditions. We have a high weed pressure to deal with as well. So we didn't have those issues down here. So if the goal is to cut on the seeding rate, this is probably where I would begin with. Seed treatment component, again, we saw a limited benefits. So maybe we need to start thinking about, is there a package within the seed treatment that we can drop because we don't have that as a limiting factor on our specific farm, right? And not lose yield so we can make more profit. So for these two aspects, seeding rates and seed treatment, this is where I would begin. And only be cautious going up here with the early planting because of those non-optimal planting conditions, right? So that's a mid-season window. Now moving on, let's talk about what happens late in the planting season. Again, the hope is that we don't need to be planting that late in the growing season. But then 2019 happens, right? So need to have some ideas what our goals are. Coming back to again that first question, what is the optimal maturity group under those delayed planting conditions? And here we are talking about 10th of June onwards, not early June. Same data here, 2 years, two locations. If you look at most of this data, you will see these bars about the same, and they have the same ladder on top of them, meaning we did not see much yield variability by going with a longer bean or going with a short bean, except this one location. So one out of these 4 site years, we did see an improvement in yield when we went with a shorter group bean, actually, that late in the planting season. So we are able to maintain or improve yield by switching to a short group bean with the delayed planting. And that makes sense because we only have a limited growing season in front of us, right? So crop maturity is important. And part of this was that we were not able to mature. And you can see that in this data here, we collected a lot of harvest moisture and test weight data. What we were seeing was with these delayed planting conditions, when we stick with our typical maturity, we were almost always 22% or higher in terms of moisture. But when we went with a shorter group bean, at least a 0.5 or shorter bean, we were down here. We were about 18% or lower than that. So by going with a shorter group bean with these delayed planting conditions, we are able to maintain a high yield while keeping those harvestability into the equation, right? A low moisture and a high test weight to go along with our high yield numbers. So that's the first component. The second component is the seeding rate. Same data here as I showed in the early and the mid planting. But now if you look at some of these regression curves, they don't look similar to what we were seeing before, right? They were more flat before. Now you can see a more vertical curve, meaning as we were pushing to a higher seeding rate, we did see a relation. We did see a benefit in terms of a yield increase. In this case, we were able to benefit by pushing to 170,000 in 3 out of 4 site years. In one, we even did see a benefit by going to a 210,000 seeds with these delayed planting conditions. And here I'm showing the yield data. So if we look at the economic returns data that I showed you before, accounting for the seed cost, we were still able to benefit by pushing to a higher seeding rate only under these delayed planting conditions. Didn't see that at all in the mid-season planting. Did see a little bit of penalty with the early season. But it's mostly coming here that where we are able to push to a higher seeding rate because, again, we are delayed in planting now, right? We don't have enough growing season in front of us. So closing the canopy sooner by putting more plants in to be able to intercept more sunlight to produce more photosynthesis becomes more important under these delayed planting conditions. Moving on to the third component, seed treatment. Here's sort of the same story that we noticed with the early and mid-season, that we did see an improvement in plant stand here, about 5% or so, that we have typically seen in other plantings in only a subset of our locations. But when we look at the profitability part, bring the seed treatment cost into equation, you see a flat line here, that we did not see a benefit in control compared to our seed treatment, that they're about at that same point of flat. So wrapping that up with the late season now, again talking about mid-season onwards. Here we are benefiting by pushing to a shorter maturity group. in terms of higher yield potential, but more importantly, the quality of those beans, right? The harvestability in terms of low moisture and high test weight. We are able to achieve that. This is the only scenario where we are benefiting by increasing seeding rate under these delayed planting conditions. Seed treatment, again, we are limited to our stand improvement. But again, that might be unique to our planting conditions, and we got to be careful with that, right? So wrapping this all up, what does this all mean here, right? I have all of my planting times here: early season, mid-season, late season. Sort of the window. Early season for us is end of April to that mid-May time, right? What are we finding there? We are really benefiting by pushing to a longer growth bean under those early planting conditions and able to mature in time, right? Much before that first killing frost occurs. And it's coming from by putting more number of pots and more number of seeds per unit area and maintaining that high seed weight. So essentially, we are able to utilize that growing season, the longer growing season that we have, by going with a longer growth bean. In terms of the seeding rate and seed treatment, we did not see too much benefit, but we got to be careful. We are dealing with non-ideal planting conditions, right? Cool and wet soil conditions. So keeping some of that, at least a seed treatment or a higher seeding rate as an insurance policy is important with those early season plantings, right? Moving on to this mid-season. The window again is mid-May and goes into early June, I would say around 10th of June. There was no difference in terms of changing maturity, changing seeding rate, or use of seed treatment. What are we finding out? Limited benefit by changing maturity group. So there's a real opportunity to maybe go towards those shorter group beans if the goal is to have time after soybean harvest in terms of a wheat or a cover crop planting or any fall management, right? A real opportunity probably right here to cut down on the seeding rate side of things, because we did not see a correlation across 4 of our site years. So wherever our starting point is, thinking about a sequential decline, 10, 15, 20% decline, maybe throw a strip in the field, and the current planting technology allows us to do that, right? Making sure it's wide enough so we can get a full yield pass with the yield monitor so we can compare yields in there, right? But there is a potential based on our data to cut down on the seeding rate. Seed treatment, again, we got to be careful. That's more unique to a specific field and its environment. But if we're thinking about cutting a component of seed treatment, maybe this is our starting point in that mid-season planting window, right? Moving on to that late season, that starts around that 10th or 15th of June onwards. Again, hopefully we don't need to be planting that late in the season, but what are our options, right? Here we are benefiting by going with a short maturity group, not only to maintain or get to a high yield, but get to a low moisture and maintain the high test weight of those beans. A definite benefit of increasing seeding rate beyond that 130,000, going to 170 and higher number is benefiting in terms of not only high yield, but high profits, accounting for the increased seed cost. And seed treatment, again, same picture, that it's more environment specific, I believe. So that will depend on our yield limiting factors in our specific field. So these were the 3 management questions we were asking, right? Variety selection in terms of maturity group, seeding rate, and seed treatment. Now we are looking at other components. And I believe Laura has done some work on that as well. How about fertility? Are we going to benefit from a starter fertilizer compared to early, mid, or late season? So we are looking at some of that data. How about inoculation? Do we benefit more by putting inoculant over here when we're dealing with those cool and wet soils, non-ideal planting conditions, right? Non-ideal conditions for maybe rhizobia to work compared to if we are down here and at the bottom. So just thinking from when we are able to plant, what management we ought to be doing to maximize not only yield, but our profits by cutting down on our input cost. And I believe that's my last slide. I think I have time for questions. Yes, sir.
Did you say your seed treatment and not?
Yeah, so the question was, did our seed treatment include an inoculant? It did not. We did not have an inoculant in there. And that's the question we are asking now, that are we going to benefit more by using an inoculant maybe early or late in that planting window?
Are you going to do inoculant versus seed treatment?
Yeah, so we are doing like nothing, naked beans, then a seed treatment, and then package that with the inoculant on top of that. So we'll have all comparisons to look at where we can get the most economic benefit. Yes, sir. Yes.
Quick question. What is the soil type for the two locations?
So the comment is, what's the soil type? So we had two locations. One was a loamy soil up in the thumb area, so more heavier ground. And then at our main campus, it was a sandy loam soil. So we're dealing with medium to a medium high texture.
So do you know what representation those soil types are in the whole state of Michigan or Ohio? How can we extrapolate the information that should be generated to the entire state?
So good question. The question is about how we can think about using this information based on the soil types we worked on to maybe a different soil type, right? So talking about Michigan, these two soils that we picked, they represent our area. So mid-Michigan and then the thumb area. So that does represent ours. But we have a lot of variability. I think Ohio has variability. We have tried to do some variable rate seeding work with Laura. But I believe Michigan got more variability. Nothing to brag about, though.
They have all the rocks.
Yeah, so it's nothing to brag about, but I think that's the reality. Down here, I believe that the ground, the soils are maybe a little bit more heavier.
In Northwest Ohio, it's clay.
Okay, so it's clay. So that's even heavier ground there compared to what we are working on. But in terms of utilizing this data, my thinking is what we are looking at is a relative difference, right? So maturity groups, that should not make a difference. Seeding rate, we might have a different threshold. So that's why I would not recommend going down to 90 or 50,000, right? The idea is based on the planting time, can we cut down more at one planting time compared to another one, right? So maybe this is I would not want to cut down the seeding rate in the late season and probably not in the early season. Maybe this is the starting point. So that's, again, I believe, across your soil types. Seed treatment is the one we got to be really careful about because your yield limiting factors will vary based on that soil texture, right? And you might have a different pathogen, insect disease pressure on the heavier ground, and if it's a no-till system compared to what we had. So that's where I guess, again, the starting point is probably here. And then see what does that, how does that translate to a unique farm situation? Because we deal with these biological systems. There's too many interacting factors, right? So we got to be careful about how we use the data from our unique locations at a different place.